He felt a thrill of expectation as the leaves rustled around him. He realized he'd never touched a girl in that way before. Such passion really frightened him, and the autumn was breathing a knowing, a certainty that innocence soon would be lost in this most romantic of seasons. The parent things wouldn't be home for hours, and there was this quickening. She'd always stopped him short in their lovemaking. She always brought the blanket from her room, and she'd always been in control. He walked outside into the warm summer night. The bulb on the front porch had burned out months ago, and he hadn't noticed her slip out of the house behind him. He smelled the sweet honeysuckle and the spicy sycamore leaves from the backyard, and something else was in the air. Suddenly, she was beside him, and he drew her close. He kissed her and ran his finger under the elastic of her shorts. He never dreamed of being so bold, but he was in love with her, and he dreamed about her. Suddenly it was more. He felt her fertile delta and thick patch of hair. He felt the wet, velvety seam and ran his finger down it, opening it and massaging the hardness that he found inside. And she didn't stop him. Amazed, he realized she wanted this new thing too. This new border crossing. This new excitement. It had always been her choice, but now a new world was beginning. He placed his wet finger under his nose and reeled. Her scent was so strong. It stunned him. It repulsed him. And it thrilled him. Was this what the sex thing was all about? Was this what his friends had been trying to tell him? He carried her out to the car and started the engine. The car hummed and he sang. She smiled a little and he died. They were children entering this new world. Maybe he was dreaming. Maybe he wasn't. Who cared? She was his, and he was going to hide her where no one else could find her. He'd been planning this trip north for weeks. Maybe Canada. His friend Alex had a cabin on Lake Harrison near Vancouver. Maybe he could put them up for a while until they found a place of their own. Alex was his best childhood friend, and knew him better than anyone else in the world. He knew how much Jim loved Pam, and he would never betray them. The general and his men would be on their trail soon, and there would be danger. He could feel the old man's fury. He'd always suspected her father, the general, of molesting her, although he could never prove it. It's probably her darkest secret. Well, later. "Where are we?" she asked, gazing through the window to the hills on the right and to the ocean off to the left. "We're halfway to Santa Barbara, dear. We can stay over at a motel there and rest up for the drive to Vancouver." He hesitated, and then he asked, "You wrote in your yearbook you planned to follow me up to see Santa Barbara and study physical therapy. What happened, Pam? Your parents tell you what to do with your life again?" She nodded. "You know how my father always made my decisions?" "Uh-huh. That's why I'm taking control for both of us. He's going to chase us, and maybe he'll find us. But you're mine now, and he'll have to kill me to get to you." After midnight, he parked the car behind the motel in case someone had managed to find him there while he slept. He carried his lovely girl into the motel room and returned for the small bag he'd packed the night before. This would be their first night together as a couple, away from the parents. He knew they would have these precious memories for the rest of their lives. He lit a candle and waited for her to return from the bathroom. Very few words were spoken now. They stood awkwardly facing each other. No parent things to claw at them now. She unbuttoned her blouse and took his hand. Pulling her shirt tails out of her jeans, she unhooked her bra. She held out her hands, and he took them. Placing his hands on her breasts, he caressed them, feeling her nipples harden. She reached out and unbuttoned his shirt and ran her hands over his chest. "You feel the same. You too." She pressed her breasts against his chest, and they kissed while she slipped his shirt off. Still kissing him, she unbuttoned her jeans and pulled them down her thighs. She directed his hand between her legs, and he felt her pubic hair, and then her vagina, which was moist. She moved back and sat on the bed, pulling off her shoes, socks, jeans, and finally her panties. Completely naked now, she looked at him and smiled. "Is this really happening? My God, you're beautiful." She stood suddenly and threw her arms around him. "I love you." He picked her up and carried her back to the bed, laying her on the quilt with her legs over the foot of the bed. He then bent over and kissed her breasts and her stomach. Then he knelt and ran his tongue down the soft inside of her thigh. She spread her legs so he could kiss between them. She arched her back, and he put his hands under her buttocks and pushed his face deeper between her legs. He stood up slowly and undid his belt and trousers. She lay on the bed, breathing hard, then slid back and put her head on the pillow, watching him undress. She watched every move he made as he came toward her, and when he came within reaching distance, she took his hands in hers. He straddled and asked, "Okay?" She nodded. He lowered himself, and she put him inside her. They kissed softly and held each other gently, caressing, moving slowly as if they had all the time in the world. But time was not on their side. Soon the general's man would arrive. He awoke at first light and heard the sound of a twig snap outside the window. "Pam, wake up. We have to get out of here. They've found us." They dressed quickly and slipped out of the rear window to the car. Soon they were speeding north out of Santa Barbara. They were well on the way to Highway 156 turnoff by the time the general's men figured out they were gone. They made good time up the long grade to Lake Cachuma and the long San Ynez River Canyon. As he turned north again at the highway to Buellton and Solvang, they felt they probably had shaken off the scent for a while. But the general had military intel on his side and would pick up their trail eventually. He stopped at a rest stop for a second to inspect the car for tracking devices. Clean. Good. Okay, good. Back on the road at a legal pace. Don't need her father's friends at law enforcement picking them up at a routine traffic stop. No speeding. "Pam, there were some sandwiches in the basket and some sodas. Let's have breakfast." "Okay." "Darling, I had a terrible dream last night. I dreamed I was at the UCLA engineering school. I was on the first floor of Boulder Hall near the elevators, and I was waiting for the lift when I saw you there holding a child in your arms. You grinned at me and said, 'Jim, here's my new baby girl. Her name is Kim.' What a horrible nightmare, Pam. Remember, that's the name we'd chosen for our first little girl." She leaned close and said, "I would never do that to you. That's always been our own special dream." He turned off the main road and looked for a shady spot. "Pam, I'll always love you, and I'll always protect you. Even if you betrayed our love and left me like your mother and father want, I would let you know down through the years that I still love you. It's a stubborn love, and it'll never go away." He pulled her into his arms and then held her close. As their lips touched, she started to unbutton her blouse. "A little warm for you?" I smiled. "No, I just want to be sexy for you," she said. When she had her bra off, he could see what he'd only been dreaming about. Heaven was there for his eyes, for his hands, and for his skin, and he could smell her. "Any regrets about us running away like this?" he said. "No, I thought about it last night. You know, if we don't fight for our love now, we would regret it for the rest of our lives." He nodded. "Also, I would be miserable for a long time if we couldn't be together," she said. "I'd miss you terribly." Then she looked down at her ring and smiled. And she said the words he'd been waiting for. "You know, Jim, we can do anything we want now. There's no one to stop us. We can make love under the trees." Chapter 2. They awoke to a late afternoon. Leaves covered their nakedness in their blanket, and even God was smiling. This was the third time they'd made love, and she announced, "I think we made a baby." "I wouldn't doubt it," he said, reaching for her shirt. "I bet we made Kim. Now that damn nightmare can never come true. I think we're going to be a family." Jim wept to himself. "Well, it's late. We better put some miles between us and your father. We can make San Francisco by late tonight if we hurry. Pack your things and we'll continue this mad honeymoon." As he got into the car, he thought he heard some cars off in the distance. "Let's run, girl." He got the car up to 60 in no time, which was pushing it for a country road. Hope the sheriff's dozing under some tree. 2 hours later, they pulled into San Luis Obispo and looked for a coffee shop. Sitting in a back booth, they found the latest LA Times. "Teenage runaways pursued north by enraged father. You know he'll have the dogs on us, Pam." "I know," she said. As the miles flew by, Pam asked, "Jim, do you think we'll make it all the way to Canada and to Alex's cabin?" "With a little luck, I think so. When we arrive at Lake Harrison, we'll have to see when the weekly mail boat leaves. You see, Alex lives at the far northern end of the lake, and the boat only comes once a week. Deliberately remote, if I know Alex." They both loved him for his warm friendship. They knew he would protect them. He hoped Alex might have some weapons at the cabin, it being so far up into the wilderness. Late that night, they pulled into a nice motel in Sausalito. Pam was really exhausted and anxious about her father's relentless pursuit. Jim kissed her gently awake and offered to carry her to bed. After locking her in the room, he went to register. He knew enough always to pay in cash and register as the Smiths from San Diego. The night clerk smiled and handed him the key. Then, sitting half naked in an easy chair while Pam slept, he began to worry. They were unarmed and certainly not trained in combat situations. He decided to go back and ask the night man if he knew where he might be able to buy a gun. The guy was nervous at first at the subject of weapons, but after explaining they were running away from McCrae's father, the guy relaxed. He confessed to being a Vietnam veteran and having several souvenirs from Southeast Asia. The .45 automatic sounded best to him, and he paid the guy $350 in cash. The vet threw in a couple of boxes of ammo, and Jim felt a little better prepared. Back in the room, he slipped into the bed quietly enough not to disturb Pam. She needed a lot of rest. Trouble was coming, and there was thunder off in the distance. He tried to relax. Chapter 3. They got up at first light. Saying little, they packed and looked through the window at the approaching October storm. "Looks dangerous and loud," said Pam. "My father can be dangerous and loud." "You've seen him like that?" I asked. "Sure, I'm just an army brat that can take orders." "Well, darling, you're out of the army now, but the war's on the horizon. Be brave, girl, and fight with me." She swallowed and said, "I've always obeyed him and feared him, you know. I know he was never nice to you, the boy I loved, and for that I never forgave him. Also, there's something much worse I have to tell you. Maybe after all this is over." My stomach clenched. Were my suspicions correct? He heard a faint rustle of autumn leaves outside the motel cabin, and he reached for the automatic. 8 in the clip and 1 in the pipe, the guide instructed him. Motioning Pam to stay low, he crept to the rear window. The man outside was definitely armed, but thought they wouldn't be. When he saw his head at the corner of the building, he squeezed off a shot. His head came apart like a cantaloupe in a car wreck. The noise was deafening, and Pam screamed in fear. "Let's get the hell out of here." They left the parking area so fast the car's doors slammed on their own momentum. He could see the general's face on the passenger side of the Cadillac. He was blind fury itself. He flipped him the bird as they sped by in a cloud of dust. Up ahead, the rain was pounding on the pavement. Then he saw something that took everything a little bit out of the ordinary. The father had turned all the way around and roared at them. Nothing on this river produced such a hateful and terrible sound as that. He'd almost forgotten this was Halloween week. All Hallows Eve. Trick or treat, motherfucker. They made good time with the Corvette engine. The big black Chevy Nomad handled well in the rain, and the evil black Cadillac didn't. The car's shocks were worn, and the brakes worked better in warm weather. The last thing he remembered seeing in the rearview mirror was the behemoth disappearing into a large ditch. Dad's sheriff escort stopped to help his screaming boss. His troops awaited orders while the old fuck pissed